TKO Boxing with Sherry Abbasi, and today I'm joined by Mr. Andy Clarke. Andy, sorry about the mishap with the headphones there, and thank you for giving me a bit of your time this evening. How are you doing today?
Yeah, good, thanks. No complaints.
Excellent. I know you've got a lot going on with your family at the moment, so hopefully you're not too stressed at the moment. Like I said a second ago, Andy, for me, I've followed your career for quite a long time, so I'm familiar with your work and what you have done. But I've always been interested to know, how did you end up getting involved in the sport of boxing and becoming a commentator and a sort of sports reporter, if you like?
So I started in radio. So I left university, which was in 1999. And at that point, really, I didn't have that much of a plan. That was quite normal because you didn't come out of university with a mountain of debt. It was still free then. I snuck in just before it began to be something you had to pay for. So you could take your time really and just have a bit of a look around, which was a real, that was a real privilege, to be honest. And I mean, there weren't that many things that were screaming out at me that I definitely wanted to do. Other people I knew chose more kind of vocational things, really. And again, I was in that kind of position where my parents were okay with me taking some time. And I just love sport. I'd always loved sport. And you look at a job like sports broadcasting, and on the face of it, you can feel like it's just this impossible pipe dream, but people do it. So I thought to myself, I should at least try. Because if it doesn't work, then I'll think about something a bit more sensible, maybe. But I thought I should at least try. And I think it was probably easier then, if I'm honest, because lots of radio stations carried their own sport, BBC Local, which still do, but I think that might even be changing before too long. Lots of local independent radio stations. I moved straight down to London because I thought that was where you'd probably have the best chance. So at that point, Capital, for example, Capital Gold Sport, was absolutely massive. Wrote a load of letters, all that kind of stuff. I was barely even on email then, to be honest with you. And I ended up at TalkSport basically because they just relaunched from Talk Radio to TalkSport. So that was lucky. London Live, I went in there. Capital, I went in there. I think something was probably going to happen for me at Capital. And once you're in the door, then it's up to you to try and make some strides. And TalkSport was a really good place to be because it's just a bit of a pirate ship, that was how it was. And it was really fun. And there were people there to learn off, and you got to do things there quite quickly, quicker than you would have done anywhere else. And it's up to you then really to push your own career as much as you can. And looking back on it, they were good because they didn't, it was expenses to start with, but that didn't last long until they actually started paying you enough so you could pay your rent and pay your bills. Because I do think that's something that can be a massive problem. I was lucky in that my parents could kind of fund it for a bit, but they didn't want to do it forever. But I think that, the idea that you need to prove yourself by being willing to work for free in the early stages of kind of really competitive industries it just excludes loads of people. And they didn't really do that, to be fair to them. So yeah, it just all went from there. And they were kind of 90% football really at the time, although right at the beginning when I got there, they did do some boxing. And I remember going to Lennox Lewis, Franz Botha, as a runner, basically, just do some stuff around. It wasn't even really working on the night. I'd always wanted to do boxing, but the kind of the way into it that I took and how things were then, you couldn't just, as you can now, kind of create your own thing and decide what you were and kind of put yourself on air, which is what you can do now. Then that was very much up to other people. And it was a while before I could really segue into boxing because there's not that much work there, basically. But I went full time in it as soon as I could, which was probably or made it my number one focus as soon as I could, which was probably about 10 years into the job. About 10 years into the job. At that point, I felt like I was doing football for Sky at that stage and the Premier League. So it wasn't like I was some kind of, finished article commentary wise, but I had credentials in that whereby they could see that I could do that. I then just had to try and transfer it. And really, as soon as I kind of got my feet under the table doing boxing, it was just I just loved it. Like everything about it, not just the sport, but just the way it was and the access you got and the places you went and the people you met and all of that. I really enjoyed doing football as well, but it's different. You know, you can't, I think a lot of the time now clubs see it as their job to keep you away from players. Whereas in boxing, you can, you know, you can kind of just turn up at the gym on the hoof really without even having arranged it. And if you're polite, then you'll probably be fine.
Yeah.
It was stuff like that, really. You know, I think that's the same for most of us. I think once you start working in boxing, as long as you're okay with the kind of chaos of it, which is even more than other sports when you're freelancing, then I just don't know how you would go back to doing anything else, because it's just, you know, it's like a drug covering boxing. You know, it's completely addictive.
Definitely, like you said, even for someone like myself who just does it as something, you know, after work or on the weekends when I can get someone on, it is, like you said, it's like a drug. Once it's got a hold of you, it's very unlikely that you're going to get away from it. It's one of those things, and that sort of leads me on to my next question. Like you said, it took you a little while to get into sort of boxing specifically. What is your earliest memory of the sport of boxing?
So I was thinking about this the other day, actually, for something I'm working on at the minute. So my earliest memory, I like all kind of sports mad kids. When you're really young, you just want to play it. You don't really want to watch it that much. So I don't really remember watching sport that much, to be honest, until I was probably about 6 or 7, which is still quite young. But when you know, before that, you know, it's just kind of it's too boring to be inside, isn't it? But my first boxing memory, the first fighter I really remember, is a fighter called Darren Dyer. So Darren Dyer was a really good amateur. And I remember him because he won a gold medal at the Commonwealth Games in Edinburgh in 1986. And I remember seeing him knock someone out, flatten someone, an Australian fighter. I looked up the name the other day. It doesn't spring to mind now. But he won the ABAs that year. And I remember seeing that as well. Now, I didn't know anything about boxing at the time. And I'm not, you know, this is not some attempt to kind of paint myself as being some kind of amateur aficionado from the age of 8. But I just remember watching him flatten this guy, and he was knocking everybody out when he won his gold medal, and thinking to myself, wow, this is awesome. And then from there, it just segued into, that was when Tyson was really coming through, and obviously being able to see him was difficult, because TV was just nothing like it is now. It's impossible to explain to people what the media was kind of like then compared to now. You just see some grainy images every now and again, but you know, Tyson was the one. So obviously later that year, he won his first heavyweight title, and then there's Bruno, and then you're into Benn and Eubank and all of that stuff. And by that point, you know, I was well gone by that stage. You know, I was down the rabbit hole, never to return by that point. But I wouldn't say I was somebody who at a young age was kind of scouring boxing news and stuff like that. I just saw it and I liked it, and I knew that, you know, it was for me. You know, I just found it absolutely fascinating. I didn't box because it wasn't in schools and I didn't know anyone who did it. I wasn't aware of a local club or anything like that. I did have a pair of gloves, would, you know, mess around with my older brother, but the key word there is older. There's no, like, anyone's got an older brother, like, particularly if they're 2 years older, there's no percentage in that. You know, when you're 10 and he's 12, all you're going to get is an absolute hiding. But yeah, Darren Dyer, to answer your question, Darren Dyer.
That's your earliest boxing memory. So like you said, you weren't scouring boxing news or anything at that point. What is the moment where you sort of pinpoint yourself looking back now where you say, this is what got me and I'm addicted? So Darren Dyer is your earliest memory, but what was the moment?
Benn Eubank.
Is there a moment? Benn Eubank.
Benn Eubank. Benn Eubank was so massive. People can't, honestly, if you, how old are you?
I've just turned 30 this year.
Okay,
so I would have been born the year the second fight happened, 1993, was it?
Right. So
yeah. So
I'm from the previous kind of tech era, if you like, to you. A tech era is probably more like 5 or 6 years, really, rather. Yeah. So I'm like 15 years older than you. And back then, back in the olden days, there were just 4 terrestrial channels. And if you managed to cross over into there was only the mainstream. We talk about now about crossing over into the mainstream. There was only the mainstream then. So if you were a sports star, who managed to get themselves time on one of those channels, you were huge. And that Benn Eubank rivalry got that. It got loads of it. I mean, I remember them signing the contract on Midweek Sports Special, which was kind of a regional thing, but you're still getting to a lot of people. And you're on, there's everything was kind of just big. If you managed to make it onto anything, it meant it was big. And obviously the viewing figures they would get would be absolutely colossal and not useful to compare to now because everything's just so different. But yeah, it was that because it was everywhere and they were just fascinating characters. You know, they were very different, but I really liked them both. I was more Eubank than I was Benn. You know, I would watch, read, listen to anything that Eubank did. You know, I just looked at this guy and just thought, wow, like this, where has this bloke come from? He's not like anyone you've ever seen before in your life. And just the interest around it was massive. And obviously Michael Watson was a big part of that. And then it continued, you know, it continued with Steve Collins and Eubank. And then you got Naz by that point. And then off the back of Naz, you're into Ricky Hatton. But yeah, Benn Eubank was, anyone my age will tell you, you know, they'll go kind of like misty eyed and start talking about it because it was unbelievable.
I think Benn and Eubank, those two names are so deeply tied to British boxing law, like you said. Even though that was a time where I was born the year of the second fight, so I've missed that whole thing completely. But even I know about them, and I've gone back and watched their fights and sort of studied how, you know, important they were to British boxing. Then to be in an era where we're talking about their sons potentially again fighting and all the stuff that happened last year, it just shows how big they were and how much they transcended the sport. And on the point of Mr. Chris Eubank Sr., he was actually my first ever interview in boxing back in 2015. So can you imagine the pressure I was under as just a young kid turning up?
Yeah, that's not an easy one. He's not an easy one.
Exactly.
Straight out the gate. How did that go?
Yeah. It actually went really well because he said to me, before I pressed record on the camera, I was shaking. I'm not going to lie. I was shaking. I thought, this is a big one, and I don't know how it's going to go. He said to me, as he does in his Eubankisms, and he's got his ways, he said, the only prerequisite is professionalism. I didn't have a clue what he meant, but I thought, okay, just speak clearly and
yeah.
Make
you know
what?
I've always found that. Yeah, I remember doing the first few things I did, and you're nervous, and everyone's nervous doing something for the first time, particularly when you've got any kind of audience, even if it's just that one person. Particularly if it's just one person, the smaller the audience, the worse it is sometimes. And
yeah,
anyone who claims they don't get nervous about stuff or weren't absolutely shitting it the first few times they did something is just lying. It's just not.
Yeah.
And it's not helpful to claim that, you know, oh, well, no, I wasn't nervous. It's just like, you know, everybody should just be happy to tell the truth about things like that, because I definitely was. But what I found with athletes generally is that they don't mind it because they understand nerves better than anyone. And if they see someone in front of them nervous about asking a question, particularly like a young reporter at a press conference or whatever, I think they get it. And they kind of feel like, well, this is important to you. And it's good that it's important to you. So yeah, I've always found them quite helpful in those kinds of situations. It's like they're kind of pulling for you a bit. They want you to do well. Yeah, that's one of the things I've always enjoyed about it, actually, that they've, you know, they can be hard work sometimes, but generally they're not.
Yeah, the interviews that I've done in person, I've always found the boxers have been very supportive, and you know, if they see you're struggling a bit, they give you a bit more time, and everything's cool. People always ask me, oh, when you met so-and-so, what was Kell Brook like? What was this person like? And I've always said, you know what? They're normal people. Like, yes, sometimes you play a bit of a character to build a fight or sell a fight. That's fine. But when you're one-to-one in that sort of space with someone, it's different. Like, we're all human beings at the end of the day. And if you conduct yourself with a bit of respect and you ask, you know, normal questions without being, you know, rude or anything silly, then 9 times out of 10, you're not going to have any trouble. I mean, Chris Eubank Sr., that's basically what it was. But again, it was just such a big personality. I was like, oh my God, you know, that's the worst, like, position. In some ways, it's the worst position to be in, but it also sets you up for everything else that's, you know, following. Because I don't know if you ever heard, you know, if you work for a terrible boss or a boss that works you, you know, really, really hard, then you know you can deal with anything else moving forward. It's kind of the same sort of principle with this, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the deep end. Eubank Senior is the deep end, because you just don't really know. You know he's not going to be rude to you. You know that he's not going to be deliberately difficult or bad-tempered, but it can be a difficult interview because you don't really know what he's going to say or where he's going with it or what to say to him when he's just said something to you. You know, that's the kind of That's the sort of issue or challenge that you would face with someone like that. But like you say, generally speaking, it's one of the best things about it. Really, is that the access is great, and fighters have to sell themselves. If you're in a team sport, particularly a popular team sport, it's not incumbent upon you to sell tickets. You know, the stadium will be full, whatever you say, and that's why I think clubs, and I get it, do kind of feel like their job is to make sure players don't say anything of any interest at all, because they're afraid of them saying something controversial. And I do understand that, because it's a massive sport. You know, if we're talking about football, which is always the easiest one to kind of go to, but fighters do have to sell tickets. They have to give people a reason to want to watch them. And I've never been one necessarily for this idea that, you know, love me or hate me, you can't ignore me. I can, you know, I mean, I definitely can if I want to, but I've always found it quite easy to divorce a personality or a persona if it's not really for me from somebody's fighting ability. Naz, to be honest with you, his persona wasn't really for me, but I really loved watching him fight, because why wouldn't you? It's you come across all sorts, don't you?
Exactly. On the topic of the Eubanks, for example, I know you've been sort of predicting, or you predicted last year, that Eubank Jr. would go on to win a world title, and obviously things went a bit pear-shaped for him in January. Then he's come back and put on arguably the most disciplined performance of his career. Whatever was going on with Ian Smith is a separate issue. He still had to go in there and do his job, and he did. We're now hearing murmurs again that the whole Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr. fight is potentially signed or looking like it's going to be put on at the end of the year. For the last year, I think it was a year this weekend just gone, with the whole, you know, the actual cancellation of the fight. Since you've been working in boxing media, how have you found this year to be in regards to that topic, the way it's been navigated and the way we still really don't know or have a solid answer as to what actually happened with Conor Benn?
Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult for exactly that reason, because right from the beginning, we've been very short on facts. We've been very short on things that everybody agrees on and agrees that are solid. Really, we've still got the same amount of them now that we had right at the beginning, which is that he tested positive on 2 different occasions. Outside of that, I wouldn't say that we really know an awful lot more than we did when we discovered that, this time? Yeah, almost exactly this time last year, wasn't it? It was the first week of October last year. And that's a bit crazy when you think about it. I'd be surprised if, looking back on it now, that Matchroom didn't feel like, and Team Benn didn't feel like, they could and should have handled this differently. But the point of no return comes early in these situations. There was a big decision to be made early on as to how you're going to do this. Are you going to put everything out in the open immediately, or are you going to do what they did, which was to essentially try and pretend that it hadn't happened? And once you've chosen whichever fork in the road that you're going to go down, that's it then, really. And that was, I'm simplifying, but that was one of the main problems that they had. I feel like if they'd said from the beginning, issued the kind of statement they have more recently, with some fighters who tested positive, and just said, look, we don't know how this has happened. 100% not intentional. We've got a lot of work to do to get to the bottom of this, but get to the bottom of it, I will. In the meantime, you know, please just believe me when I tell you that I don't know what happened. And I feel like if he'd done that, it probably would have been kind of over by now. You know, everything else around the consistency or lack thereof in punishment, you know, there's so many issues involved in this, but it's not been handled well. I don't think anybody could claim it's been handled well. And I personally find it hard to see how he's going to get licensed to box in the UK for December the 23rd, which is the date that they're talking about. Yeah, it is kind of bewildering, and it doesn't do the sport many favors, to be honest with you. But I can understand why Eubank's happy to take the fight wherever it ends up being, if it is in Abu Dhabi, because, you know, things have switched around. Last time he was, it would have stuck in his throat, but Conor Benn was the one who was in the position of strength. He needed Conor Benn maybe more than Conor Benn needed him slightly in that situation, but it's completely the other way around now. So I guess it would be £160, no rehydration, nothing like that. And that you have to pick Eubank in that situation, I think.
And like you said, it's been a whole year since that incident's taken place, which is kind of scary in the fact that how quickly time has gone. And also the fact that Benn has then gone on and had a fight in that time without, really clearing his name per se. How much do you think this whole time period and the incident is going to impact British boxing and drug testing moving forward? Or is it a matter of no one can really do anything now and he's fighting again, so people will just move on?
Well, he's fighting again outside of the UK, but I don't feel like there is any real support for him being licensed in the UK until we are allowed to see some workings, basically. The British Boxing Board of Control obviously want that's the kind of route they want to go down. You can't really stop people getting a license. Well, you actually can't stop people getting a license somewhere else. There are 51 commissions in America. You'll always find one who'll do what you want. Middle East, they obviously, I assume are happy to license him in the Emirates for that fight. I feel like this can do some good because it has had a big spotlight shone on it. Some relatively big name journalists in the world of sport have taken an interest in it and won't let it go. So I don't see how it can be brushed under the carpet in the UK. If he's going to get his license back in the UK, then I don't see how that's going to happen without us being presented with a convincing explanation as to how this happened and as to why he should now be allowed to box again.
Yeah, I think, again, like you said, it's just a matter of the waiting game now to see what happens with that appeal. And who knows how many other twists and turns we're going to have in this story, but it's sort of happened now, and they're going to push ahead with the fight either way. So again, it's not going to be in the UK, but it's going to happen. Money talks, and we know the game we're in when it comes to boxing, so it's all about the money. I sort of want to move away from the controversy of that and sort of touch on maybe something a bit more positive as boxing fans. And that was a fight we witnessed this weekend, just gone, with Leigh and Josh Warrington. What did you make of the fight? I know it was pretty one-sided for Josh, but the finish from Leigh, I think you used an analogy of a football match being 5-1 and then turning it around in 1 second like that. That only happens in the sport of boxing. And what were your thoughts of Leigh sort of miraculous turnaround at the end?
It was just that, wasn't it? It was miraculous is the word, really, because I did 5-1 down at halfway. The first round was tight, so you could have had 4-2 maybe. I think Froch gave that one a draw, but 3, 4, 5, 6 were obviously Warrington rounds. 2 was obviously Woods round. And he was in trouble, he was in big trouble. But that is the incredible thing about boxing, and it's not the same in any other sport. People can talk all they want about last-minute goals and all that kind of stuff, but you need to be within striking distance for that to count, for it to make any difference. And in boxing, you can be well behind, as he was, and you can turn it around in the blink of an eye, and that's what he did. It's an amazing story, because I remember commentating on his Commonwealth title win back in March 2019, and he was absolutely delighted to win that, to get that opportunity, because he'd been drifting. He was in the doldrums. He was going absolutely nowhere. He just couldn't get fights. And off the back of that, he got into the golden contract, lost to Jazza, but then on the same bill as Josh, on the one where he lost to Lara, he got the chance to win a British title against Rhys Mould. And that was seen as pretty much 50-50 at that point, I think, really. And he won the fight. And since then, he kind of took Josh's fight against Kanju, which, that was the one they'd been looking at for a while, but obviously went because he lost to Lara. And it's been amazing what he's done since. I felt for Warrington because it's just so brutal boxing, and that for me is the real brutality of it. They punch each other. That's what the sport is, and for some people that's brutal and that's too much. But for me, the real brutality of it is in just how quickly something can turn around, like it did in that fight. Because your whole world just comes crashing down around your ears. And you could see at the end that he knows what's happened, but he just can't really believe it. Yeah, it doesn't get any more dramatic than that. It really doesn't. I'd like to see it again, to be honest with you. I mean, it would have to be at super featherweight because Leigh would have said that, hasn't he, basically? And I think he's probably been struggling to stay at featherweight for a while. But when you're champion, that happens, doesn't it? Because you've got the belt and you don't want to give that currency up. And that's how you make your money. But I'd be perfectly happy to see it again.
And I think, like you mentioned, the fight was so good and the ending was so dramatic that a rematch at sort of the Forest Ground, that will sell here massively. And with the two rival fan bases as well, and it being where it is, I think that's a sellout, really, isn't it? Especially with the history of the first fight now as well.
Yeah, I think they could definitely sell enough tickets. I mean, it's 30,000, I think, Forest, and then you've got the pitch as well. I mean, that's a lot. But at the same time, I remember when Bellew went to Goodison to win his world title against Makabu, they kind of put it in the corner of the ground rather than slap bang in the middle. And atmosphere-wise, that worked absolutely fine. So if they felt like they could see how it went, basically, see how the tickets went. And if it wasn't maybe as many as they thought, then they could look to do that. But he's absolutely earned that. And with those two, they are the two that you would choose to really justify going outdoors, because it's a big deal. It really is. Like, for the broadcaster as well, it's a massive undertaking. So those decisions are not taken lightly. But it's a brilliant experience, an out open air fight. Weirdly, I kind of prefer arenas, to be honest, atmosphere wise, because you've got the roof that keeps everything in and you've got the sound bounces off. But it's great going out. I've been really lucky with that. I've been to so many. We had one this year in Bournemouth, and because that was a little bit smaller than some of the others, it was, it was great. It was just as good as any of the others. And I think the City Ground would be tremendous, absolutely tremendous. And he was winning the fight, Warrington. I mean, you're a long way out from the tape, so you can't claim that he nearly won. He wasn't happy with the stoppage, but I thought the stoppage, I understood the argument that he could have been given a minute. I absolutely understood it. But I also thought that what actually happened was fine. But there's unfinished business there, definitely. So I think it'd be quite an easy sell.
You mentioned Tony Bellew there, and I had a question which sort of links to Tony Bellew and Leigh Wood. Leigh Wood has sort of had a late career sort of high now, winning a world title towards the back end of his career and going on and having success. He lost it, he came back. Tony Bellew sort of won his world title, I think 5 fights removed from his last fight, and obviously defended it once, and then he went on to the David Haye situation. How many boxers can you think of who sort of peaked that late and did that well, where they managed to get their highest of highs towards the back end? And how far do you think Leigh Wood can go if he chooses to go against like someone like Joe Cordina, who's obviously the division above and he's a world champion?
I think if you're Wood, you just keep going until you feel like you've dipped a little bit too far, until you feel like you're going down the other side of the hill. And he'll know when that happens. I mean, he's had quite a long career. It's been difficult in terms of the frustration of it earlier on, but I wouldn't say up until this point he's taken too much damage. I mean, he got stopped by Lara, obviously. He's been in some hard fights. That was a hard fight on the weekend. And he's not afraid to fight. So there is some wear and tear there, I would say. It's quite common, really, for fighters to hit the kind of the big time in terms of what they'll get paid, at least towards the end. You really do need to try and stick it out. You look at like someone like, I'm doing some work on a book at the minute, and Bellew's one of the fighters that I'm looking at who's in it. Froch is another one. And again, the big money for them came towards the end. And Bellew was saying to me, I did it for the glory. Boxing, we all do. I always wanted to be a world champion. And as soon as I became a world champion, then it was about the money. And that's how it has to be. And it's the same with Froch. It was Groves and Groves. Those two fights, they're the ones that really made him the big money. He would have done pretty well out of the Super 6 Classic, but I don't think it was anything like the World Boxing Super Series. Now, for example, Calzaghe's another one. He had that WBO for a really long time, but it was only towards the end that he unified and then fought Hopkins and Roy Jones Jr. And those were the fights that would have made him his money, really. So I think that's part of the challenge, is that you just got to keep going and stick it out and stick it out and stick it out, because if you can just get there, then the money does tend to be backloaded. But kind of to answer your question more, with Wood, it is incredible because he won that British title against Rees-Mogg, good performance, and then he got the fight with Kanju because Eddie kind of made that fight, presumably, expecting Warrington to win. And then he needs someone, and Leigh's in the rankings, and that's great. So he gives him the opportunity, and he wins, which people weren't really expecting. Michael Conlon, a lot of people would beat him. I was one of them. I thought that he'd be able to outbox him. But again, he just hung in there right until the end and got the win. Recovered from the defeat against Lara, got him back in the ring within a matter of months, which at the time seemed a bit crazy. But when you look at it, it was a really, really good decision because I don't think Lara really... He took his eye off the ball, didn't he? And the weight became a problem, and getting him back in there so quick was kind of genius in the end. So, yeah, I mean, it is a hell of a story. It is a hell of a story. But... not that uncommon for someone to just plug away and plug away and plug away. Would have been loads of times where he probably would have thought to himself, I just don't know if this is really going to happen. And he'd have thought about giving up. And then all of a sudden, it happens. And then you just got to ride it for as long as you can.
I think when you think of like big moments, like you said, Leigh Wood's biggest moments have been the last 2 or 3 years, the big fights. Even someone like Terence Crawford this year, his biggest moment against Errol Spence. I know it's been a few months removed, but that performance, I actually flew out to Vegas for that fight. I was there live. I said to myself, if that fight gets made, that's history. You got to be there. And the atmosphere, the whole week or 3 or 4 days that I was there, unreal. As a boxing fan, just to be up close and seeing it all, and the type of performance he put in, which I don't think anyone expected to be that one-sided, even if you were picking him to win decision, stoppage, whatever. Now we're a few months removed. What are your thoughts on that performance? Have they changed at all? And if the rematch does go ahead, there's been some talk about February potentially, regardless of weight class. Do you think there is any chance Errol Spence can turn it around against Crawford, or is it sort of done?
I'd be pretty surprised if he managed to turn it around. I mean, he is a big welterweight, and he'd been at welterweight for a long time. You know, he'd held that weight for a long time. But at the same time, that was just such an unbelievable performance from Crawford. It was great that the fight got made. And then when it happens, you just want it to really break out of our kind of boxing world and command a lot of attention, and then be a brilliant fight or a brilliant performance. And we got a brilliant performance rather than a brilliant fight. And I couldn't quite believe it sitting there watching it. I just felt like at some point Spence would find some answers. And then I think after maybe the third round, I thought, it's not going to happen, is it? This is a one-sided beatdown, which I just wasn't expecting to see. I really, really wasn't. And it was pretty breathtaking, to be honest. And as you say, Crawford has been a world champion, undisputed world champion, but that was the fight that he wanted. That was the real big money fight that he wanted, and he got really well paid for the one before that too, of course. But he's made that mega money now where he can just kind of almost sort of relax because that's taken care of and just go after just whatever he fancies. And a rematch, you can understand why Spencer's going to take it because he's got his pride. It's impossible to kind of expect him not to take it, to be honest. And they'll shift up to super welter, you'd imagine. But I don't really see it making much difference.
That seems to be the general consensus online and from a lot of people who follow boxing. But crazier things have happened. I'm sure we can agree on that as well. Andy, I don't want to take up too much of your time. Just got a few more questions. I remember there being, I think it was Max Kellerman. He was talking on a segment once on ESPN, or when it was back in the HBO days, and he said about boxing being a sport that commands attention, and he sort of used an analogy of 4 corners, street corners, and he said, you go to one corner, there's basketball, you go to one corner, there's football or whatever, and the other two, and one of them's got a street fight or boxing. Goes naturally, as human beings, we would be drawn to watching a fight. This year, we've seen an incredible run throughout the sport. A lot of the big fights have been made. Yes, some have fallen through here and there, but for the most part, we've got what we wanted and some surprises along the way. Most of the fights have delivered. We've had some murmurs of Showtime potentially leaving the sport. If that is the case, how does that impact the sport in America? And what do you think is the next move for someone like Al Heyman and his stable?
It's an interesting one, that, because I completely agree with what Max Kellerman said there, and this is something I've been looking into myself. And a fight is just something that people understand, and they are drawn to it. And anybody can watch two people go at it, and they get it, the dynamic of it. They know what's at stake there, and there is something very kind of intoxicating about it. And boxing has that. Boxing's always had that, and there hasn't really come a point where anybody seriously suggested, not for a while anyway. I remember when I was a kid, this used to happen quite a lot, particularly after Michael Watson. If there was an injury or, God forbid, of a fatality, people would call for boxing to be banned, and you'd see somebody turn up on the news from the British Medical Association and stuff like that. That used to be quite common, but it doesn't seem to really happen too much anymore. People seem kind of happy with the fact that this is a sport and always has been, and that people want to watch it. What we've got to be careful of is the media landscape, like I said earlier, is totally different to that now to how it used to be, and that there are just so many more platforms out there. And what it means is that everything kind of exists much more in its own bubble. And in a way, that's good, because there's loads of boxing available for all of us who are into that, and we can watch it every week, and there's a demand for it. And people understand that viewing figures are not the same now because there's so much choice out there, and the 15 million people who watched on ITV, you're not going to get that any longer because the world has changed. But at the same time, we don't want it to retreat too far into the woods, if you like. People still need to be able to find it or chance upon it. They can do that in the UK because it's still on Sky, it's still on TNT. Most sports fans will have one of those two or both. Not everybody. My brother's a big sports fan, for example. He refuses to pay for any subscription channels, and that's his decision. I do understand that is still pay TV, but to an extent, when it comes to sport, I'm a bit biased because of Sky, but given how established they are almost like the terrestrial sports broadcaster in a sense, if that makes sense. In America, it's kind of different, isn't it? Because ESPN, I've heard rumors about them. That would be bad, if they decided that they didn't really need to pursue boxing anymore. Showtime, like HBO is a kind of pay TV channel, the like of which we do have here, but only kind of more recently. My point is really that you want people to be able to kind of channel surf and find boxing. That might become more difficult to do. It'd be great if one of the big networks in America decided, let's get back into boxing, NBC or CBS or someone like that. But the problem with boxing really is that, as brilliant as it is, for TV, it is quite difficult because somebody can get cut the week before a fight, and that shitload of money you've spent promoting the fight and doing all your stuff around it, the fight's not happening. That just literally does not happen in other sports. Or you don't get the fight that you think you should get. I mean, trying to explain how boxing works to people who don't really, who aren't experienced in it, is very hard sometimes. And you can easily get people. You can easily get people at TV networks who are used to dealing with other sports. And I mean, how would you even start? How would you even start trying to explain to them, well, why can't our guy fight that guy? Because they're the two best in the division. Well, he's with a different promoter and they're on a different TV network. What's that means? That's never going to happen. Probably. That's tricky. That's tricky. So it is a bit worrying, the Showtime thing. I didn't really see it coming either, because PBC have been absolutely smashing it this year. Amazon, maybe, that's something you hear. DAZN, I'm sure they'll be interested in taking them on as well. But I think if it went off ESPN, then that wouldn't be a good thing either. I don't know that's going to happen, but it's just, and you hear rumors about different stuff all the time, but I mean, it is just something I've heard.
I think it goes back to that the Larry Merchant thing, doesn't it? Where he said nothing can kill boxing and nothing can save it, or something along those lines.
Yeah. No, it's always been that again. Yeah, that's pretty much nail on the head stuff, really.
Yeah. Andy, just before we finish, can I just ask about your book, the title of your book, and when you think it's going to be ready by, and a bit about the content?
So I've got to finish it by the end of the year. So I've kind of alluded to it on the boxing show, on Boxing News a few times, but I've not really kind of talked about it. But it's on the knockout, basically. It's on the knockout in boxing. Sport's most decisive victory and defeat, I think, is the line. And it's basically about that, all aspects of it. What does it feel like to win by knockout? What does it feel like to get knocked out? And I go into it in real depth. What do people remember about it? What are their initial reactions to it? What's the mentality involved in committing to that? Because all boxers are brave, obviously, but not everyone goes in there looking for the knockout or wanting to win inside the distance. Different kinds of knockouts, that one punch that your opponent doesn't see, anyone can get knocked out by that. And then you've got the deep in the fight, grueling knockouts where you've kind of broken the other person and you take them out. And it's, how do you get over it? Trainers, referees, the whole, what's it like to watch it? If you're a family member or whoever, or for us, we've just kind of talked a little bit about the appeal of it. That Kellerman quote, what's that all about? Like, why is it so appealing? Should it be? Because you're essentially the reaction at ringside. You haven't been at ringside when someone gets knocked out, and it's weird, isn't it? Because you are all there for that. You do want to see it. I'm not squeamish, but then when it happens, you do wince. You do wince because you've got this small space, essentially 20 square feet normally, and somebody wins by knockout. But for somebody to win by knockout, somebody has to get knocked out. That's the really unfortunate thing about it. And you've got one fighter celebrating, usually very briefly, and the other one just stretched out. One. They're not really that jubilant a lot of the time. Most of the time, it's kind of relief that it's not them. That's something that's kind of come through from researching it all. I'm really enjoying it anyway, and I've got to finish it by the end of the year. I'm about 2/3 of the way through it, and it's one of those things where it's kind of, what do you leave out rather than what you put in? Because it's been, the people I've kind of approached to do it, they've all been up for it, really. So it's something different, and it's fun. I'm taking a break at the minute because my wife's due to give birth like any time now, and at the very latest it'll be on Saturday. So I think the rest of this month I'm going to leave it alone. I've got a couple of people I need to get hold of, but other than that, it's looking in pretty good shape. And it's one of those things where you kind of, I've never done it before. You're kind of writing it and you're just thinking, I'm pretty sure this is good stuff, but you don't really know. You need someone else to read it, which somebody else is at the minute. So hopefully in a couple of weeks they don't come back and just say that this first 60,000 words I've written is absolute shit. That would be that would be upsetting.
Andy, why, just out of interest, since you've mentioned it, why the knockout? Why did you choose to focus on that particular thing?
Because it's just this unbelievable moment in sport. It's just this incredibly dramatic moment in sport, which has no equal, as we just discussed. It has no equal. True. And just the repercussions of it, it can ruin your career getting knocked out, but it's this physical thing that happens to you. So I go into in a bit of detail with one of the board doctors, like what happens when someone gets knocked out. The transmission of force, down this kind of lower mandible into your jaw joints, into the brain stem. Why do some people take a punch better than others? And there are no answers to some of these questions. And then you're kind of more to the sort of spiritual of like, well, what is it about that person that means that they won't kind of, it doesn't seem to happen to them, but it happens to other people. What is that? It's really, it's just such an incredible thing to have in the sport, the knockout, because it's awful when you think about it in a lot of ways. And what's it like for the people who are actually in there trying to do it to each other? Because it's one thing for us, but for them, it's kind of, they sign this pact. And they know that, particularly at a high level, if you're in an even match, it could be you, it could be me. It's you've got to have that acceptance that it could be them, but they have to decide that it's not going to be them. It's like mentally, how do you get your head around all this shit? I mean, it's I don't think anyone's really done it, funnily enough. And you need to be a bit lucky with, generally speaking, lent most heavily on people I know, because some of the questions are a bit awkward, or it might be something they don't really want to talk about. Because I could understand why you might not want to talk to me about getting chinned. I mean,
Yeah.
why would you? In a lot of ways, but yeah, and there isn't. The more you think about it, the more you try and think about, is there anything else that you can compare to it? And there isn't. There's nothing. I mean, I don't know if you follow football, but the golden goal was this thing that emerged in the late 90s, whereby if somebody scored a goal in extra time, FIFA tried it in a couple of World Cups and a Euros. If you scored a goal in extra time, that was it. Game was over. Sudden death overtime, basically. And people didn't like it. They didn't like it, and obviously that only works. You've got to have the team's got to be drawing to have that. So it's in that sense, it's not like that. But it was because that lands and it's over, and it was really dramatic. But FIFA quickly realised that people didn't like it. The players didn't like it. The coaches didn't like it, to the point where they weren't willing to commit to try and get one because they were scared of conceding one, and they didn't want to. It's a similar kind of mentality. If you're going to try and knock someone out, by definition, you're opening yourself up to make you make it slightly more likely that you will get knocked out, and people don't want to do it. So that's why this is quite a select band of fighters who just go for the knockout. And fans didn't like the golden goal either, because they're just like, this can't be right. A second ago we were full of hope here, and we were still capable of winning, and now we're fucked. Like that's not right. That's not fair. But we have it. We have a knockout.
Wow, that's actually really interesting, Andy. And I'll be honest, I'll be very interested to read the book. Do you know do you have a release date, or does it not work like that? You have to finish it. And
no, it does. Yeah. So it's going to be next year, kind of. I mean, one of the things that made me think about it was that end of next May is 10 years since Wembley and Froxgroves 2.
Oh yeah,
which is just like, obviously just like an unbelievable knockout for all sorts of reasons. It's kind of the perfect knockout because of the stadium, the rivalry, the stakes. It was the end of Froch's career, but also because George was fine, and he went on to do what he did after that. So it's a guilt-free, merciless chinning, which is what we all want, because you don't want to see someone collapse to the canvas and then think, God, they might. I remember seeing one at Spurs, like when Callum Smith knocked out Lennon Castillo, and it was horrendous because you watch his leg twitching, you're thinking this bloke might be dying. I mean, and it can happen. We know it can happen. So it'll be out by then. Basically, it's not. I mean, it's not just about that by any stretch. But that's one of the ones. That's one of the ones I look at. So, next year at some point.
Amazing. We look forward to that. And Andy, before we go, can you just tell us a bit about your other half's business? I think chocolates, was it?
The chocolate, yeah.
Yes, that's it. I was interested.
Yeah, sure. So she runs her own business called Lucoco Chocolate, LUCOCOA. And she's been doing that for the best part of 10 years now, full time for I think about the last 6. So she imports beans from, where's she getting from? Haiti, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, and Belize, and just makes it all from scratch. Like the USP of it basically is there's no white refined sugar or artificial sweeteners. It's all coconut sugar and this thing called lucuma, which is like a superfood, and sort of a sweetener. So it's there's plenty of calories in it. There's no point claiming that there isn't, but there's very few ingredients, so it's kind of it's good stuff. LuCocoChocolate.com, you can find it online.
I was going to say that. Give us the link for that.
Yeah, LuCocoChocolate.com. Yeah, have a look. It's not cheap.
Is that available in shops as well, or just the website at the moment?
No, you can find it in shops. It depends where you are, really. There's a few in London. There's a few kind of scattered around the place, but it's not in any big chains yet. But yeah, you're best off buying it. You're best off buying it online.
That's fine. I'll be sure to link that on wherever I post it as well. Yeah, just to help out with that. Yeah, Andy, we are pretty much done. It's 2 quick fire questions.
Sure.
First one: your top 3 fighters in the sport of boxing at the moment.
I would go for Crawford, Inoue, and I think you've got to say Canelo. People seem a little bit reluctant to give Canelo maybe the props that he deserves, because he became undisputed so easily, a super middleweight. It'd be basically, you know, and the other one who's really close for me is Usyk. If Usyk beats Fury, then, you know, we need to come back to this. But
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, I'd say those three. That's a pretty formidable trio.
Yeah, solid. We can't argue about any of their legacies, and they've all been undisputed as well. So no arguments. And the last question, Andy, I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase it so it doesn't sound silly. When it's all said and done for you, when your career's done, hopefully once you've lived a long, healthy life, how would you like to have people look back on your career and your contributions to the sport of boxing?
I mean, if people did, then just really simple. Just, you know, someone who loved it, loved the sport, was always enthusiastic about it. You know, never got old for him. Just a good guy. You know, we're all just facilitators in this business. You know, it's interesting, the media, because it's easy for people to get a bit carried away with their own kind of self-importance and take themselves a bit too seriously. It's perfectly possible, and this was drilled into me from the beginning at TalkSport, and this is why it was such a good place to be, because there are a lot of very capable people there. You can take what you do as seriously as anything without taking yourself that seriously. It's very achievable. That people seem to think that it's not, that, you know, to do a really good serious job you have to take yourself incredibly seriously all the time. It's not true. It's not true. You know, you have to be able to laugh at yourself and enjoy it, because otherwise, what are we all doing this for, really? We do this because we enjoy it, don't we? And I don't ever want to see anybody covering sport where I feel like it's a chore to them, and that, oh, it's all a bit old news, and I've been doing this for a long time, nothing surprises me, that they're weary of it. You know, I never want to see that, ever. And I certainly hope no one ever has any reason to say that about me.
Well, now, Andy, I think a lot of people, especially UK-based, who know you, they respect your views and obviously they take you seriously. So you've got a good reputation. So you've done well so far. Let's hope you carry on doing well with the book and everything as well, Andy. Andy, I just want to say a big thank you. You've given me a lot of time today. I really appreciate it. And I think that also reflects on how much of a fan you are of the sport, where you can just sit and talk about it like that.
Yeah,
so,
no, I love it.
it
Just, you can't, you know, there's always so much to talk about, isn't there? Yeah, every week there's something, you know.
Yeah.
Next week there'll be something new,
exactly,
without a doubt.
Yeah. So I just want to say thank you, Andy, and hopefully, maybe not anytime soon, but I'm not going to try and do your head in too much, but hopefully get you back on the channel sometime soon as well. Maybe close to the release of the book a few months from now, once you've completed it and stuff, just to touch on that. And maybe a bit about amateur boxing, because we didn't really get to touch on that today. We went on a more professional boxing level, but I know you've got a lot to talk about amateur and stuff, so definitely I'd be very interested to speak to you about that as well. But thank you so much for coming on, Andy. Really appreciate it.
No worries.
Thank you.